Have you ever felt like you're not real? Like when you're in a room full of people and you can see them, hear them, touch them, and feel them, but not the other way around? The dictionary defines a vacuum as a space that is entirely devoid of all matter. And a lot of the time, that's how I feel about the things around me. Trapped inside myself, trapped in my own world, while everybody else seems to be getting along just fine. What I've just read to you is an excerpt from a journal that I used to keep. That entry was written in August 2012, only a few months before I was clinically diagnosed with major depressive disorder. I was only 14 years old then. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I actually wanted to talk about today. As an overly emotional teenage feminist whose interests range from defending subordinate groups in society to protecting the environment, to discussing the quantum physics theory, the list of topics I could have raved on about today is pretty much endless. But then I thought, which one of these topics means the most to me personally, and which one do I feel is the most important to discuss today? Well, as you may know, over the last few years, the prevalence of mental illnesses has soared. There are now more than 450 million people around the world suffering from mental illnesses. Depression and schizophrenia make up 13% of the global disease burden, more endemic than cancer or heart disease even. And while the spectrum of mental illness is much larger than we may realize, today I want to focus on depression to speak to you about how this illness kills slowly and painfully and still goes largely unnoticed by a majority of society. Well, I know recently there has been an increasing number of people who have started to talk about their illness and realize the importance of getting help. And this bravery, this courage, and this change has what inspired me today to not only share my own story, but also give you a little bit of insight on how crucial it is for us as a society to encourage people to speak up about their mental illnesses. Now, many of us are aware of the clinical symptoms of depression. The lack of interest in activities we used to enjoy, the changes in appetite, the inherent sense of tiredness that just won't leave. But what do we actually know about the reality of the disease? Well, for the longest time, I couldn't eat. I felt a compulsive urge to sleep all the time, and I was cutting myself 3 or 4 times a day just for some slight relief. I isolated myself from everyone. I was always crying, and I felt a sort of emotional pain that made me write notes, then sit in the bathroom seconds away from attempting suicide, many times. But depression has multiple sides, multiple faces, and what I've described to you is only one of them. There are many times where depression is less obvious and less pitiable. What I realized as I got older is that I progressed from being angsty and frothing with self-hatred to just being extremely tired, extremely uninterested, extremely depraved of all emotions, sort of like an emotional necrosis that both terrified and crippled me. And that's what we tend to forget in general, that depression doesn't always manifest itself in the way that we expect it to. Sometimes depression is just lying in bed for 3 days, unable to move, or depression is the fact that dragging yourself to school and sitting through all your lessons is the biggest thing you've accomplished all week. And these quieter, subtler forms of the disease are often overlooked because they're not as obvious. But what we have to remember is that just because the illness doesn't appear passionate on the surface doesn't mean that it's not legitimate. It's so important for us to talk about these less obvious forms of depression, because if we don't, we end up with the idea that depression has to present itself in a certain way to be considered worthy of treatment. We end up devaluing people suffering from other forms of it. We end up disempowering them, we end up oppressing them, and taking away their voices. When I was diagnosed in 2012, I was shocked, to say the least, because even though I had been displaying symptoms for about 4 years prior to that, I never really knew that depression had its own name. I'd always been told that I was lazy or that I had a bad attitude because naturally, those are the words that you use to describe someone who won't get out of bed, someone who's failing school because she cannot bring herself to care about it. And that was also the year that I lost 2 of my best friends, because I was finally bringing up the concept that I was going through an actual diagnosable disorder, and they rejected it, saying things like, oh, stop being so whiny, and you're so dramatic, and it's all in your head. And this is just one example of the stigma that many people suffering from mental illnesses face, because as a society, we have been conditioned to think that depression is the same thing as weakness, that depression is a choice, that depression isn't a chemical imbalance in the brain that can happen to literally anyone. And these misconceptions aren't just false, they're harmful too, because when we enforce the idea that depression isn't a real illness, we end up brushing it off as not being important enough for discussion. We end up with people not wanting to step up and admit to being depressed, and that means that no one will want to get help. So here are a few statistics just to help put things into perspective for you. Since I've started my speech up here, oh, that's my title. Since I've started my speech up here, at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people around the world have committed suicide. That means that by this time tomorrow, 2,160 people will have killed themselves. And out of that, 2/3 of them, as well as another 121 million people around the world, would have been suffering from depression, while only 20% of them are actually getting help. Now, I may not be a mathematician, but considering that treatment has generally high rates of success, this just doesn't seem to add up the way that it should. The problem here is that no one wants to talk about depression. We consider it as a secondary issue just because it's not physical. We don't teach teens in schools about the risks of mental illnesses the way that we teach them about physical ailments. Companies and corporate offices offer sick leave, but only expect their employees to use them for doctor or dentist-related appointments. It's socially acceptable to stay home from school or work because you're feeling under the weather, but not because you hate yourself or you want to die. How do we fix this problem then? Well, the answer is simple. We just need to start talking about it. We need to start educating ourselves on the way that depression, as well as many other mental illnesses, affect those that are suffering from them, so that we become a little more understanding. We need to recondition ourselves and destroy the idea that mental illnesses are subordinate compared to physical illnesses. So I'd like to end my talk today by asking every single one of you to spend 5 minutes discussing mental illnesses and the importance of recognizing them with someone. This is the only way that we will ever remove the stigma. This is the only way we will spread awareness and make it more likely for those suffering from mental illnesses to step up and ask for help. 5 minutes, it goes a long way. I truly believe that as a society, we have the capability of finally understanding and acknowledging mental illnesses the way that we should, the way they should have done a long time ago. 5 minutes goes a long way. Thank you.